Schwepcke, and I want to give you a slightly longer introduction into this. It's not too long, but to set the scene for what we're doing tonight. It all started with a poem, which Anthea Bell beautifully translated in memory of Werner Mark Linz, when the pain felt at the loss of this inspirational man was still raw. For me, it perfectly symbolized his life, first as the founder of the New York publishing house Continuum, and then as the director of the American University in Cairo Press. The ginkgo, that eastern tree, in my garden plot now grows. In its leaf there seems to be a secret that the wise man knows. Is that leaf one and lonely, in itself in two divided? Is it two that have decided to be seen as one leaf only? To such questions I reply, do not my love songs say to you, should you ever wonder why I sing that I am one, yet two? Johann Wolfgang von Goethe sent this poem to his beloved friend Marianne von Willemer as a token of his affection. He pasted two dried, crossed leaves of this ancient tree below the three stanzas and dated it the 15th of September, 1815. Now you know why you're here. Goethe, Germany's greatest poet and polymath, natural scientist, statesman, and true cosmopolite, had picked the ginkgo leaf as the symbol of hope, long life, and above all, deep affection. The poem was his ode to friendship and symbolized the union between old and young, man and woman, human and the divine, literature and scholarship, but above all, East and West. A union which, in his mind, was inseparable. And so in Weimar, at the base of the Divan monument, it says, know yourself, and in that instant, know the other, and see, therefore, Orient and Occident cannot be parted forevermore. The poem became part of his West Eastern Divan, which Goethe was inspired to write when he read the first German translation of the Divan composed by the 14th century Persian poet Hafiz. Goethe called Hafiz his twin and decided to enter into a lyrical dialogue with the other. The Persian and Arabic word Divan means assembly. Hopefully Narguess is not going to correct me on that. Goethe proceeded to assemble his own divan of 12 books of poetry, calling them nameh, the Persian word for epic poem. He added a second part, Notes for a Better Understanding, which included a chapter on a prospective divan. Considering his own divan incomplete, it was his suggestion of how a divan might be attempted by poets and scholars in the future. The West Eastern Divan, published in 1819, was Goethe's very personal attempt to broaden the horizons of readers both ignorant and fearful of the Islamic world. From the time of the Persian Wars, the Orient had been seen as alien, as a threat to the West, a threat, however, that was central to the formation of Western identity. To everything, there is a season. These words open the scholarly essay part of the West Eastern Divan. Today, we face another era in which the West feels threatened by Islam, by the other, by the unknown, which, whilst understanding very little about what this means, is all too often equated with religious fundamentalism. To everything there is a season, Goethe said, and the season now seems right to attempt a divan for our times, a new divan. The new divan has a very clear start today and a very grand finish. Tonight, at the start, exactly 200 years after Goethe sent his poem to Mayana, we will hear from Iran's foremost novelist, Mahmoud Dowlatabadi, how Hafiz inspired Goethe. Joachim Sartorius, poet and former Secretary General of the Goethe Institut, will tell us how he and a small group of literary grandees will select 12 poets from the East and 12 from the West, who will enter into a lyrical dialogue with the other. Their works will be translated either via a bridging text or in a series of translation workshops in which translators and scholars will work together with English language poets to create interpretations of the original poem, a second lyrical dialogue, so to speak, which Narguess Farzad is going to have an expert who is an expert, much more of an expert in translation than I am, an expert on classical and contemporary poetry who specializes in translation, will speak about tonight. This great project, which we are launching tonight, will culminate in the new Divan, the assembly of Dichter und Denker. In German, it's a very, very nice alliteration. Divan der Dichter und Denker. Lovely. Never mind. Didn't quite translate. Got lost in translation. But it will be an assembly of poets, scholars, and translators at the Barenboim Said Academy in Berlin in 2019 on the 200th anniversary of the publication of the West Eastern Divan. And I'm actually thrilled to say that the Dean of the Academy is here tonight. So, talk to him, blame him. We are celebrating this launch with a volume, which is meant to be an inspiration for this new Divan. It would not have been possible to put it together without the help of two men, to whom I owe a very special thank you tonight for this incredible feat. And these are Rahim Golami, where is he? Hiding. and and my long-suffering deputy and fellow trustee, Harry Hall. They worked tirelessly to realize this perfect symbol of what we are launching today. Like the West Eastern Divan and the Gingko Library, it is two yet one. Part poetry, inspired by the other, part scholarly writing for a better understanding. On one side, the original work, on the other, the translation. This is a book, and I hold it up here, in 4 languages, with 2 beginnings, and therefore no end. And as great poetry is a symbol of our shared humanity, and as this project is supposed to foster better understanding, I have the support of my fellow trustees, and I checked with them. He's sitting there nodding. And the Vorstand der Stiftung Gingko Library, that the proceeds of the sale of this inspiration volume tonight will go towards supporting refugees which have appealed to our shared humanity and have been the victims of failings of a better understanding between East and West. In fact, tonight we have removed the price tag from the book in order not to put an upper limit to your generosity. So feel free to support this worthy cause. Dig deep, exactly. But I wanted to, of course, introduce you in person to also my author, Mahmoud, Dowlatabadi, who wanted to be with us tonight in person, but because of his failing health and other, certain problems which still separate us, has only been able to record a message, and now comes the challenge to the technically challenged Barbara. I have to hit this.
چه هاست در سر این قطره محال اندیش؟ سلام. بسیار متاسفم که آنجا در میان شما نیستم. این غایب از حضور کمترین آسیبی است که از برهم خوردن روابط معقول بین المللی متوجه ارباب هنر و فرهنگ می شود. اما به رغم این آشفتگی در مناسبات و به رغم این جهان پرآشوب، خاصه در غرب آسیا که من هم از جمله مردمان آن هستم، میباید بگویم که راه حل نهایی بشری درک متقابل تفاهم در گفتگوهای منطقی و پیوسته است میان مردمان به ظاهر متفاوت و در باطن یکتایی در گوهر و ذات و چندایی در آداب و مناسک و زبانی که در سر هر ملت آفریننده ادبیات می بوده و هست و در هر دوره و هر جغرافیایی که پدید آمده است انگیزه و مقصدی جز شناخت و شناساندن و تفاهم و همدلی نداشته است. بر همین اصل در این باورم که برگزاری کنفرانس ها، نشست ها و گفت و شنودهایی از نوع کینگو خوب است که وجود، حضور و تداوم داشته باشد، زیرا خود مسیر گفت و شنود و درک خردورزانه تفاهم را گشوده می دارد. نیز دریچه است اگرچه نیم بسته برای برآوردن صدای اعتراض نسبت به خشونت، مرگ و جنایاتی که جریان پیوسته و غمبار دارد. دریچه‌ای که شاید به شمعی روشن مانده است در قلب تاریک بداندیشی ها. و اینجا و آنجا چه نیکوست که انگیزه برگزاری مراسمی که همکنون در آن هستیم به برکت حافظ و گوته رقم خورده است. نمایندگان مقبول از شرق و غرب. او گفت روشنایی بیشتر، دریچه ها را بگشایید. این آخرین عبارت یوهان ولفگانگ فون گوته است، پیش از آن که دیده بر این جهان گذران فرو بندد. اما گوته می‌دانیم که شیفته آفتاب بود و من مایلم تعبیر کنایی خود را از بیان او داشته باشم و بینگارم روشنایی، آفتاب، حافظ و شرق. چو آفتاب می از مشرق پیاله برآید، ز عارض رخ ساقی هزار لاله برآید. حافظ، شخص باید دیوانه باشد تا خود را با تو برابر بینگارد. گوته، دیوان شرقی. بله، چنین است. در ازل پرتو و حسنت ز تجلی دم زد، عشق پیدا شد و آتش به همه عالم زد. جلوه ای کرد رخت، دید ملک عشق نداشت. جلوه ای کرد رخت، دید ملک عشق نداشت. عین آتش شد از این غیرت و بر آدم زد. آری، چنین است جهان بینی حافظ. آفرینش در عشق، از عشق و برای عشق. روشن شدن، برافروختن هستی در شکفتن نخستین. فرشته عشق نداند که چیست، قصه مخوان. پس آدم موضوعیت عشق آمد و آن درخشش جاودانه در آدم گرفت و آدم به صورت آفریدگار خود بار امانت را به وجدان برگرفت. اندوه و دغدغه ازلی ابدی، هستی و شدن در مسیر ناممکن کمال. حقیقت، گذر از آزمونی سخت برای رسیدن به اصل، همه او شدن. در نظر حافظ عقل برای درک هستی ظرف خردینه است، زیرا حرکت و جنبش هستی به عشق است و هم با عشق و اشراق می توان در آن حضور داشت و هست بود. گوته با معیار غزل حافظ برای شعر 4 اصل قائل می شود: عشق، می گلگون، پیروزی امید، ستیختن با زشتی. با ترکیب و تناسبی چنان موزون که چون کلام حافظ دلنشین باشد و جاودان بماند. باید گفت درکی چنین عمیق از حافظ به واسطه زبان دوم شگفت‌آور و تحسین برانگیز است. اما من همچنان تردید دارم که یک خواننده عادی بتواند حافظ را جز در زبان فارسی، آن هم به تدریج و در مسیر عمر، عمیقاً درک بکند. زیرا جان هیچ انسانی را گنجایش پیوسته این همه انباشت معانی، کشف زیبایی، ناپرابستی عشق و نازکای حکمت نیست. پس غزل حافظ را بهتر است همچنان خواند که سروده شده است. به تدریج و در مسیر بیش از نیم قرن بارها خواندن حافظ اگر به نیاز خوانده شود، هرگز حس تکرار در انسان ایجاد نمی کند که در هر بار خواندن خلاقه او نکته تازه‌ای به دست توان آورد. به راستی چه هاست در سر این قطره محال اندیش؟ خیلی متشکرم.
like to say one more thank you, because without my friend Margie and Tehran, this video would not have come together. We were hoping to establish a Skype link with Mahmoud tonight, but while the internet is okay to send emails to support a Skype link, it's simply too weak. So apologies, he wanted to be here in person, even to just wave at us all, but he, I think, said it so beautifully in his video. And now I hand over to Professor Sartorius.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, I think it's a great pity that Mahmoud could not come to London and be among us. And I think for you, it would have been much more entertaining to have a conversation between him and me, he speaking Farsi and I speaking German. And, well, dear lovers of the Gingko Library, dear friends of Haus, when a German reads or hears the word to launch, he thinks in the first place of a man in formal dress who throws a huge bottle of champagne against the bow of a big new ship which will soon start its maiden voyage. In a way, this is exactly what we have been invested with by the courageous and visionary publisher Barbara Haus Schwepcke. We, that is Mahmoud and myself, having been given the wonderful task of launching the new Divan, a project which does indeed resemble to a huge vessel sailing between East and West. Barbara has given you already the broad outlines of this ambitious undertaking, starting tonight, and spanning 5 years, with important landmarks in Berlin in 2019, marking the 200th anniversary of Goethe's Western Divan, and 1 year later at the 2020 Gingko conference to be held in Hafiz' hometown in Shiraz. Hafiz is one of the key figures of this project, and Mahmoud Dowlatabadi has just spoken about him very, very movingly. The other one is Goethe. As you all know, the West-Eastern Divan, published in 1819, was Goethe's homage to the great Persian poet, and through him to Islamic culture in general. Goethe, throughout his life, was full of curiosity, interested in 1001 things, a cosmopolitan to his bones. Already as a young man, he was interested in the Far East, in India and Japan. Later, his focus turned more and more towards Persia and Arabia. Goethe consulted Carsten Niebuhr's description of Arabia from 1772 with its fantastic hand-colored engravings of calligraphy. I think his later passion for studying and learning calligraphy may have had its origin in contemplating these stirring plates. And he was an assiduous reader of all the travelogues available in his time dealing with the Near East, engrossed himself in numerous biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, and of course indulged in Galland's collection of the tales of 1001 Nights. But the turning point from playful interest to deep investigation was Joseph von Hammer's translation of the Divan of Hafiz. This book was published by Goethe's own publisher, Cotta, who gave him a copy in the middle of May 1814. Also, the translation was not very inspired. Hafiz's poetry struck Goethe deeply. In his Tag- und Jahresheften 1815, his notebooks of 1815, he remembered, "And I had to find for myself a productive stand. Otherwise, I could not have held my own against this powerful figure. The impact was so vivid. Thus, I had to find an occasion for participation." And the result of this participation Goethe uses the word of Teilnahme, was his westöstlicher Divan, his most extensive lyrical work. And I think this is one of the most beautiful examples of the influence a single book can have when the reader, Goethe in this case, is so receptive and appreciative. I cannot talk about Goethe's Divan at any length now, so it is a foil and the background against which the Gingko conferences and the project of a new Divan take place. Barbara has already mentioned the Gingko poem in the westöstlicher Divan. The full title is Gingko biloba, the Latin word biloba meaning two-lobed or two-lipped, indicating the particular form and structure of the Gingko leaf. The Gingko poem is a moving ode to friendship and love, to the union of the human and the divine, of East and West. Therefore, I think it's really the most appropriate name you can give to these conferences and all the projects ahead of us. Mahmoud, Dowlatabadi, and I call on fellow poets and scholars to submit works of poetry and research, following freely the model of Goethe's West-Eastern Divan, which consists, like the Gingko leaf, of two parts, one of poetry and the other of scholarly essays on the East. And Barbara has mentioned this already. In the second part, Goethe included a chapter on the prospective Divan, a Divan of the future. The immediate task for us will be to identify an equal number of Eastern and Western poets, 12 poets of the MENA region and 12 from the West, and to start translating their work so that it can be appreciated properly by readers of all languages involved. A group of well-known writers, Adonis and Amos Oz among them, and a group of distinguished editorial advisors, Narguess, Farzad, and Michael Schmidt, among them, will form a board to identify and approach these 24 poets by the end of this year. Just to make it more concrete for you, Adonis has already nominated the Moroccan poet Mohamed Beniz, raised in the traditions of both Islamic and French humanities, and among many other things, a brilliant translator of Stéphane Mallarmé's Le coup de dé jamais n'abolira la Sarre into Arabic, as well as Sulaya Abu Risha, a woman poet from Jordan who excels in love poetry. Goethe's Divan is a dialogue between him and Hafiz, whom he considered a twin. But considering our world today, we have to broaden this German-Persian lyrical dialogue. Our Divan will have poets writing in Farsi, Arabic, Turkish, and Hebrew, as far as the Eastern poets are concerned. And the Western poets should come from all European countries, provided they feel a kinship to the spirit of Goethe's Divan. And as I said before, all these works, gathered hopefully by September 2016, a year from now, will be translated either using literal scholarly translations as a bridge, or else holding translation workshops with the aim of creating new poetic works in the process. Thus, translation will have a key role in the whole venture. Goethe's concept of Weltliteratur, and he was the first to coin this word, is not thinkable without the circulation of works through translation. One striking example, of course, being indeed Hammer's translation of Hafiz. Translation creates orbits on which works can travel far, and often with astonishing results. Let me dwell briefly on this topic of translation, which played already a big role in the afternoon discussion. You all know probably the infamous dictum of the American poet Robert Frost: poetry is what is lost in translation. And I would also like to quote the French poet Michel Deguy. He said, "The more a poem is itself, the more it cannot be translated. The more it is linked to a location, the more it cannot be transplanted. But taking all this into consideration, one must nevertheless see that the supposed untranslatability of poems have been disproved by 1,000 translators over the years. The successful translation, in my view, is based on a universal dimension contained in all poetry. And this dimension becomes a wire on which we perform the high wire act of translation, a universal idiom of sound and feeling. A careful, informed translation is an X-ray image of the original. There's a tradition of translator poets infusing the works they translate with their own sensibility. My long experience with poetry and translation tells me that these translations done by fellow poets, are often the best. In Germany, many renowned poets did and do translate the work of poets they admire. Paul Celan's translations of Ossip Mandelstam, for example, form a notable group of works. They tend to come out 60% Mandelstam and 40% Celan, but it is the result of such an appropriation that counts. Perfect German poems of striking form and devastating beauty. It is my hope that the advisory board for the new Divan will find excellent translator poets who will be willing to do this labor of love, for translation is the alpha and omega of our whole initiative. The first seed of this venture was planted by Werner Mark Linz, who devoted, as a longtime director of the American University in Cairo Press, a large part of his life to making the wealth of Arabic literature known to the West. Like Goethe, he felt the urge to broaden the horizons of readers ignorant of the Islamic world and to offer them the possibility to enrich themselves with this eminent part of Weltliteratur, making it clear at the same time to Arab friends that we know about the abundance of their culture beyond all fanatism and religious excess. Barbara shares his convictions and has taken care of this seed in drawing up the plan for a new Divan. Today, after all the upheavals, turbulences and local wars in the 20th century, it seems that the Near East will never regain its former shape. It falls apart. In the West, due to terrorism, rising fundamentalism, and the appalling destruction of cultural heritage by religious fanatics, fear is mounting. It is an immense pain for all those who love these lands and their civilizations to see death and destruction spreading, and to feel as a correlate how inaccurately the West now perceives the East. In this context, the new Divan is a desperate attempt to demonstrate that this other can be a source of inspiration rather than of fear. Despite the bleak background, it hopes to illustrate how East and West can continue to inspire each other. In my years as head of the Goethe Institut, I was confronted almost every day with the question of the meaningfulness of cultural exchange, when this exchange was overrun and crushed by political, military, and economic acts. My belief then and today is that we have to assert the importance of dialogue, of exchange, of translation in the widest sense of this word, against the immense pressure of events. We are not allowed to lose the hope that many of these attempts, small as they are, absurd as they seem, will strengthen the rich tradition of mutual encounters. In the field of literature, poetry can make audible a very different kind of Arabia, Persia, and North Africa. Literature cannot be destroyed. The Islamic State has destroyed the Baal Shamin temple in Palmyra, a symbol of tolerance and of syncretism of different religious beliefs. What the Islamic State would like to destroy, but cannot destroy, is a great literary heritage of the Muslim world. For my closing remarks, I would like to dwell on the notion of inspiration, since it is vital to our venture. Just as Goethe was profoundly inspired by Haus, so his West Eastern Divan inspired other German writers like Friedrich Rückert and August von Platen, and had also repercussions in Eastern Europe, where Alexander Pushkin and Adem Mickiewicz created, following Goethe, poems that examined the Islamic world and its ways of life. Has Arab, Persian, or Hebrew poetry inspired European poets in the 20th century? I do not know of an example which could be compared, even in a faint way, to the lyrical dialogue between Hafiz and Goethe. Are there reasons for that, other than the fact that poetry from the Near East has not been widely translated into German, and I do not know exactly the translation seen in Great Britain. But there seems to be also another barrier. After a Mutanabi festival in Zurich, where contemporary Arab poets read from their work, a Swiss friend, a friend who loves poetry and has antenna for it, took me aside and said, "This poetry is in the first place a highly pathetic, abstract murmur." I tried to contradict him, but he continued, "The Arab poem has freed himself from two rigid rules. It wants to exhibit its modernity, but there's no adhesion to the ground. I'm missing any concrete facts, even the name of a street, the brand name of a product, the physical state of the lyrical eye, headache, fever, dementia would greatly help." Slowly he calmed down. I agreed with him that in the poems we just heard, there was not the slightest hint at the breakneck changes the Arab countries were experiencing today, and that the metaphoric language used remind me more of Novalis, of late English Romanticism and French Surrealism. "Yes," he said, "that is it, exactly." I quoted this friend at some length because he seems to formulate a general mood which makes the reception of contemporary Eastern poetry much harder. First of all, every Arab poem is rooted, its language stemming from the Quran, whose ramifications and contradictions the Western reader of poetry does not understand, to say nothing of appraising it. In many contemporary Arab poems, there's also a philosophical mooring in pre-Islamic texts and in Sufism. To really understand the Lebanese Fuad Rifka or the Moroccan Mohammed Beniz, we should first study the writings of Ibn Arabi or Al-Hallaj for some years. The push to modernization reached Arab poetry in the 1950s and 1960s. It was triggered by a substantial but still very selective translation of modernist Western poets. In fact, the choice is telling. Saint-Jean Perse and not Henri Michaud, T.S. Eliot and not William Carlos Williams, Rainer Maria Rilke and not Bertolt Brecht. Pathos seems more in demand than down-to-earth lyrics, spirituality more than nihilism, subjectivity more than the empirical eye, which only proves that we always assimilate that which best fits our world. We in Western Europe, after Trakel, after Rilke, went through the schools of cynicism, sarcasm, and greatest skepticism. And the American poets taught us laconism, and that narration is compatible with a poem. We could therefore say, in a terrible simplification, that today in the West, cerebral, objectivist, chilled poems come into being, whereas in the East, the great emotions and the great metaphors do still prevail, defining most of the poetry written there. It may be just this contradiction which makes it so difficult for many of us to be truly moved by Arab poetry of today. But there are so many reasons to concern oneself with this poetry. First of all, most Eastern poets do still have a strong faith in the power of poetry. Second, the Arab language, as well as the Persian and the Hebrew, and the Arab as well as the Persian and the Hebrew languages belong to the great languages of world poetry. The countries of the Near East form one of the oldest linguistic areas of the world. Important parts of our own culture had their beginnings on the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris. Poetry, as we still understand it today, started there with the songs of Enheduanna 4,000 years ago. And we can feel this tradition, this ancient tradition, in the poems of Adonis Darwish, Benis, Sadi Youssef. This should make us receptive again, and at the same time free us, the poets from the West, from our anguish about using a big word or a bold, grand metaphor in our own poems. I'm convinced that the new Divan will have effect in this direction. Poetry, in the words of Kamal Abu Dib, will continue to exist as a conscience in a world that has no longer a conscience. Again, I call with Mahmoud Dowlatabadi on fellow poets, writers, scholars, translators to join us in this tremendous undertaking. I have thrown my bottle of champagne, the big ship gases pace, full speed ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, خسته نباشید. Looking at you, looks like it's been a long day, but we're very nearly there. First of all, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to Barbara and to Ali, to Gingko Library and to the British Institute of Persian Studies. For you, Barbara, for conceiving of this idea and persevering with it, and for Ali to organize our gathering here at the British Academy. We've all been caught by this incredible energy that you, Barbara, and Ali exude, two meteors who've come together. And I think if anyone was going to see us through, the synergy of these two fairly hard taskmasters as well will see us through. And by 2019, many of us will be completely grey rather than just partially grey. When a few years ago, at a lunch that extended to an afternoon tea round the corner from British Museum, when Barbara, who had only just recently met, suggested this idea, I thought, why a new divan? Why retranslate perhaps some of the old popular poems and put them together along with contemporary poets? And when I thought about this idea for longer, I thought, why not? Why not, at this time, take a leaf out of the 19th century scholars and poets' ideals and merge them with the legacy of the poetics of enlightenment we have been discussing at this forum, with a deep bow to Goethe and a nod to acknowledge the Herculean efforts of Joseph von Hammer as translator. We shall take stock of the best and the most representative poetry of a region who for longer than a millennium has produced spellbinding poems. And it still continues to captivate new audiences as it borrows from and lends to other cultures and all the while reinvents itself. At this conference, we have looked at historical figures who accelerated the falling of the scales from the eyes of people who were resigned to accommodating the demands of their absolutist masters. And we alluded to the lifting of the divine shield, which seemed to allow kingly powers to rule with impunity. In equal measures, we need to also flag up the parallel literary movements that emerged from across the Middle East to support the evolution of new forms, concerns, and contexts for poetic expression. This has not always been easy. In a culture where, for example, the beloved, more often than not, is the divine, clad in celestial robes and intoxicated never by cheap plonk, but always by the wine of creation. Nima Yushij, often referred to as the father of modern poetry, who was born a year after the assassination of Nasiruddin Shah and who came to Tehran aged 12 in 1909 to enroll at the Saint Louis School founded in 1862 by the French Lazarist missionaries, was one of several poetic voices who dared challenge the hold that the traditionalists and the formalists had on poetic composition. In his poetic manifesto for Change, he addressed Hafiz, and he said, "Hafiza, این چه کید و دروغی است که از زبان می و جام ساقی است نالی ار تا ابد باورم نیست که بران عشق بازی که باقی است من بران عاشقم کو رونده است." Oh, Hafiz, what are these fabrications and deceits that gush out from the tongues of the wine and the cupbearer? If you howl till the end of eternity, I won't believe that you love he who is immortal. I love she who's transient. But the irrepressible Hafiz, who knew that tales of love and separation are woven into the DNA of the Persians, and who must have anticipated with premonition Nima's hissy fit, responds, یک قصه بیش نیست غم عشق و وین عجب که از هر زبان که میشنوم نامکرر است. The angst of love is but a mere story, and yet strange that however many tongues related, it's never dull. So, the poets of the East and the West need to touch base again and to share new stories of love and separation and solitude and exile, and tell of the joy of being alive and to strive to be just and to be the balm that soothes scars of brutalities and to engage with each other's poetry. And the old translations of the gods of the genres need to be spruced up and fathomable for the 21st century readers. And we need to compile these stories in the new Divan, and we need to deploy all the resources of the host languages to make them a new home fit for the special qualities of these original poems. And that will be the task of the translators. And let's not even begin to touch on what their challenges might be. Translators are those who read a text closer than any critic ever does, and walk the minefield of delivering the quintessential features of the original poem, the tone, the subtleties, and the accent of the authorial voice, while all the time trying to gauge the expectations of the foreign reader. But before we worry about these intermediaries, we need to shortlist the 12 poets from each side, whose works will feature in the new Divan. What a task! I don't envy the judges of this poetic fame academy, but we are fortunate because if there was anyone who could, as part of a team, bring order to the Persian side of this madness, it would be Mahmoud Dowlatabadi, whose words you heard. He was one of Iran's most formidable, prolific writers. And I thought for those of you who may not be familiar with him, just a very brief introduction. His repertoire included journalism and acting too, with matinee idol looks. Dowlatabadi was the star performer of many very avant-garde plays, staged not only written by Iranian playwrights, but at that stage in the 1950s, mostly by Arthur Miller and Bertolt Brecht, for example, before he found his niche as a novelist, playwright, essayist, and short story writer. Dowlatabadi was born in 1940 into a family of farmers from northeastern corner of Khorasan, where he worked alongside his father, chopping wood and taking the produce to the market, but all the while reading anything that he could get his hands on. He then made his way to the capital, Tehran. And it is Dowlatabadi's incredible memory of rural communities and the idiosyncrasies of characters who emerge from amongst the forgotten and the disenfranchised that electrify his novels, such as the 10-volume, 3,000-page saga of Kalidar, that traces the lives of a nomadic Kurdish family, as well as the Colonel, a Gingko publication, which is only available in translation in German and Persian. It is still awaiting permission to be published in Persian in Iran. And Dowlatabadi is adamant that he will not give it to any of the publishers outside Iran who would be delighted to produce this book. He would like this book to be published in Iran. And yes, I've got a list of others, his other works, Waiting for Solutions, A Missing Solution, etc. But anyway, there's no shortage of material on him that you can touch up. Crucially, he spent 3 years in jail in Iran in the 70s during the Shah's time. And it was during this time that he conceived of this novel. And it sort of almost guaranteed his sanity because he did not want to miss anything. So upon release, he wrote it down in a frenzy of about 70 days, and that was his final draft. Dowlatabadi is a master wordsmith, and it is his grasp and familiarity with the rich lyrical variations of Persian poetry that makes him an obvious contender amongst the rank of the great and the good who will be trusted with this project. So I think it will be safe, certainly with Mahmoud and Joachim. I think it will be an enjoyable journey. Thank you.